Hey, everyone, and welcome back. We're diving into a topic that's super important for all you UPSC aspirants out there, especially as you gear up for those mains exams. We're talking about the Consumer Price Index, or CPI, as it's more commonly known. Now, I know you're thinking CPI. Doesn't exactly sound like the most thrilling thing in the world, right? But trust me on this one. Understanding the CPI isn't just about memorizing some definition for an exam. It's about getting a real grip on how India's economy actually works.
What's fascinating about the CPI is that it's often talked about as this single number. But in reality, it's a whole bunch of different indices, each with its own story to tell.
Okay, so let's break it down a bit. What exactly is the CPI at its most basic level? Imagine a shopping cart filled with all the stuff an average Indian household buys, food, clothes, rent, the whole shebang. The CPI tracks how the prices of everything in this basket change over time. And that gives us a measure of inflation, which is just a fancy way of saying how much more expensive things are getting.
Exactly. And the great thing about having all these different CPIs is that we can really zoom in on specific groups of people. Like, for example, we have the CPI for industrial workers and another one for agricultural laborers. This lets us see how inflation hits different parts of society in different ways.
So it's like getting a much clearer picture of inflation instead of just a blurry one. That makes a lot of sense. But hold on a sec. I've been hearing some talk about India changing its CPI. What's that all about?
You're right on the mark there. India's planning some big changes. One of the most important is shifting the base year from 2012 to 2024.
Okay, but why is changing the year such a big deal?
Well, think of it like updating your wardrobe. The way people spend money and what they buy changes over time, right?
Mm.
So we need to make sure the CPI basket reflects those changes. That way it stays relevant and gives us an accurate picture of today's inflation.
So basically, we're making sure the CPI isn't stuck in the past. Now, there's another issue that's been causing a bit of a stir, and that's whether or not to include free stuff from the public distribution system, PDS, in the CPI. Just to remind everyone, the PDS is that system where the government provides subsidized food to a lot of people, right?
That's right. And this is where the debate gets really interesting. On the one hand, you could argue that including these free goods would give us a more realistic view of what households are actually spending. After all, these goods are a big part of many people's budgets, even if they're not paying for them directly.
Right, I can see that.
But on the other hand, doing that could make it tricky to compare India's CPI with other countries. You see, most countries don't include this kind of non-monetary stuff in their CPI calculations.
So it's a tough one. Trying to stay true to the Indian context while also playing by the global rules.
Exactly.
This sounds like it could really shake things up.
It definitely has the potential to. And for you UPSC folks out there, this is where you really need to put on your thinking caps. Being able to really understand these changes, weigh the arguments on both sides, and figure out what the consequences might be, that's the kind of skill that'll help you stand out.
So it's not just about memorizing facts and figures. It's about understanding the bigger picture and the real-world impact. This is starting to feel less like dry economics and more like a detective story. But how does all this CPI drama actually affect the average person? And maybe even more importantly for our listeners, how does it affect those who are aiming to become IAS officers one day?
Well, let's say the CPI suddenly shoots up because of something like, oh, I don't know, a massive hike in fuel prices. The Reserve Bank of India, the RBI, they keep a very close eye on the CPI. It's their main way of measuring inflation. Their goal is to keep inflation at a steady 4%, give or take a little bit. And if the CPI tells them that inflation is getting out of control, well, they might have to step in and do something about it, like raise interest rates.
And raising interest rates basically means making it more expensive to borrow money.
Exactly. That can help cool down the economy a bit because people won't be spending as much when borrowing is expensive. And hopefully that'll help bring inflation back under control.
So it's like the RBI is using the CPI as a kind of compass to steer the economy in the right direction.
That's a great way to put it.
And knowing how all this works is super important for anyone who wants to be involved in making those big policy decisions, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. Understanding the CPI isn't just about passing an exam. It's about understanding how those everyday economic decisions are made. Everything from how much we pay for groceries to the interest rates on loans.
Wow. It's amazing how something that seems like just a bunch of numbers can have such a huge impact on our lives.
It really is. And for our UPSC aspirants, I can't stress enough how important it is to go beyond just knowing what the CPI is. You need to really dig deep and understand how it connects to all the different parts of the Indian economy. Trust me, the examiners love to throw curveballs on this topic,
Yeah.
so being prepared is key. Welcome back, everyone. Ready to really get into the nitty-gritty of the CPI?
I'm all ears. We've talked about what it is and why it matters, but how does this thing actually get calculated? It can't be as simple as just tossing a bunch of random items in a basket and seeing what happens to their prices, right?
Haha, you're right. It's definitely not random. It's a very systematic process, and understanding it is actually really important, especially for those UPSC exams. Those examiners, they love to test your knowledge on how these economic concepts actually work in practice. So let's break down the CPI calculation step by step, shall we?
Hit me with it. I'm ready to become a CPI expert.
Okay, so first things first, we need a starting point, a reference point, if you will. That's where the base year comes in. And as we discussed earlier, India is shifting its base year to 2024.
Right, 2024, got it.
Think of it like the starting line of a race. We're going to be measuring how much prices change compared to that year.
Okay, 2024 is our starting line, makes sense. So what's next?
Next, we got to figure out what exactly goes into our shopping cart, or to use the fancy term, the basket of goods and services. This basket is supposed to represent what a typical Indian household buys.
So like groceries, clothes, rent, that kind of thing.
Exactly. All the everyday essentials, plus a few of those little extras that people like to splurge on every now and then.
So it's like creating a miniature version of the Indian economy in a shopping cart.
You got it.
Yeah.
Now, for each of these items in the basket, we have to collect price data from all across the country. And I mean all across the country. We're not just checking prices in some fancy mall in Mumbai or Delhi. We need a truly representative sample, right?
Yeah, to get a real sense of what people are actually paying.
Exactly. So statisticians go out and gather prices from all sorts of retailers, big supermarkets, small neighborhood shops, you name it.
That must be a ton of data.
It is, but that's how we make sure the CPI reflects the real cost of living for everyone, not just a select few.
Makes sense. So we've got our base year, we've got our basket of goods. What happens then?
This is where things get a little more technical. We have to calculate something called a weighted average, because not all items in that basket are equally important, right?
Right. I mean, I spend way more on groceries each month than I do on, say, going to the movies.
Exactly. So each item gets a weight based on how much of the average household's budget it takes up.
So it's like giving more importance to those essential items that everyone needs.
Precisely. Once we have all the prices and their weights figured out, we can finally calculate how much the overall cost of the basket has changed compared to our base year 2024. And that, my friend, is how we get the CPI.
Okay, so it's a pretty involved process.
Right.
But the main idea is to track how the cost of that representative shopping cart of goods changes over time.
Exactly. And that CPI number, it's not just some random figure. It has a real impact on everyone, from the folks making big policy decisions to everyday consumers like you and me.
Speaking of policy decisions, let's talk a bit more about how the CPI influences what the Reserve Bank of India, the RBI, does. They're basically the ones in charge of keeping India's economy running smoothly, right?
Absolutely. The RDI has this huge responsibility to keep inflation under control. Their goal is to keep it around 4%, plus or minus a little bit. And their most important tool for measuring inflation, you guessed it, the CPI.
So the CPI starts going crazy. Like if it shows that inflation is way too high, the RBI has to do something to bring it back down.
Exactly. Let's imagine for a second that fuel prices suddenly skyrocket. That's going to cause a big jump in the CPI, and that's a big red flag for the RBI. They might decide to raise interest rates to try to cool things down.
And raising interest rates basically makes it more expensive to borrow money, right?
Right, which means people and businesses are less likely to borrow and spend money. And that can help slow down the economy a bit and hopefully bring inflation back to that 4% target.
So it's like the RBI is using the CPI as a kind of economic speedometer.
Perfect analogy. If the noodle starts creeping into the red zone, they got to hit the brakes by raising those interest rates.
Makes sense. But what if inflation is too low? Like what if prices are barely moving at all?
Well, in that case, the RBI might actually lower interest rates to encourage people to borrow and spend more, to give the economy a little boost, so to speak.
It sounds like a delicate balancing act, trying to keep inflation in that sweet spot.
It definitely is. And understanding how the CPI plays into all of this is super important for anyone who wants to work in the Indian Administrative Service. You need to be able to connect those dots between CPI, what the RBI does, and how the whole economy is doing. That kind of in-depth knowledge is what those UPSC examiners are looking for.
So for all you future policymakers out there, let's do a quick review of what we've covered. We went through how the CPI is calculated step by step, and we saw how it plays a crucial role in guiding the RBI's decisions about interest rates and all that. But there's one more piece of the CPI puzzle that we need to talk about, and it's a big one. That's the whole debate about whether to include those free goods from the PDS in the CPI calculation. That's a whole other can of worms, and we're going to tackle it head on in the final part of our CPI deep dive.
Stay tuned.
Welcome back, everyone. We've covered a lot of ground in our CPI deep dive, from how it's calculated to how it guides those big economic policy decisions. But there's one more twist to this story, and that's the debate over whether to include those free goods from the public distribution system, the PDS, in the CPI. This is where things get really interesting for you UPSC folks.
Absolutely. Just imagine yourself in that exam hall facing a question about this very topic. You need to be prepared to analyze it from all sides, weigh the arguments, and really show off your understanding.
Okay, so let's put on our analytical hats and dive right in. First up, what are the arguments for including those free PDS items in the CPI?
Well, one of the main arguments is accuracy. Including these goods could give us a more complete picture of what households are actually spending, especially for those who depend on the PDS for a lot of their food needs.
So it's about recognizing the economic reality for a large portion of the population. But wouldn't doing that make a CPI artificially lower? I mean, if you're including things that are given away for free, wouldn't that make it seem like inflation is lower than it really is?
That's a great point. It's definitely a potential consequence that we need to think carefully about. And that's one of the main concerns that critics bring up. They argue that including free goods could make it really difficult to compare India's CPI with other countries. Most countries don't include these kinds of non-monetary transactions in their CPI calculations, so it becomes a bit like comparing apples and oranges.
Right, so there's some real challenges there in terms of how we measure and compare things.
Yeah.
What other concerns do critics have?
Another practical challenge is figuring out how to assign a price to something that's giving away for free. That would require some pretty complex adjustments to the way we currently calculate the CPI. But here's where your critical thinking skills come in. Think about the broader implications. How might this change affect the way the government measures poverty, for example?
That's an interesting point.
If the CPI goes down because we're including those free PDS items, it might suggest that inflation is lower than it really is, at least on paper. And that could potentially have an impact on how poverty is measured and how resources are allocated to address it.
So we're seeing how a change to the CPI, which might seem pretty technical at first glance, can actually have these ripple effects across different policy areas.
Precisely. And that's what makes economics so fascinating. It's not just about numbers and formulas, it's about people's lives. And for UPSC aspirants, this debate about PDS items is a perfect example of how those economic theories play out in the real world of policymaking.
Absolutely. All right, as we wrap up our deep dive into the CPI, let's do a quick recap of the key takeaways. We started by defining the CPI, looking at the different types, and understanding how it's calculated. Then we explored how the CPI plays this crucial role in shaping those big economic policy decisions, especially what the RBI does with interest rates. And finally, we tackled this really complex and interesting debate about whether or not to include those free PDS items in the CPI.
Remember, this isn't just about memorizing facts for an exam. The CPI is a window into how India's economy works and how it affects millions of people. So keep asking those tough questions and exploring different perspectives.
Exactly. And if you're preparing for those UPSC exams, make sure you have a really solid grasp of the CPI. It's a topic that comes up all the time. But as we've seen, it's also a topic that's important for anyone who wants to understand how the world around them works.
Before we sign off, I'd like to leave you with one final thought. As India's economy continues to grow and change, how do you think the CPI basket itself might need to evolve in the future? What new items might need to be added or removed to make sure it accurately reflects the way people in India are spending their money?
That's a great question. And it's a reminder that learning is a lifelong process. Hit that subscribe button and give us a like for more deep dives into these critical topics that can help you ace those UPSC exams. Until next time, happy studying.